Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us for the first in our Toolkits Poetry live sessions, an Australian poetry and express media partnership. So I'm joined today by Evelyn Araluen to talk about Aboriginal histories and poetry. Before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which Evelyn and I are broadcasting from, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their elders past and present. So this is the land from which we work in professional and creative capacities. This is stolen land and sovereignty has not been ceded. So I'd also ask that you all take a moment to acknowledge the country on which you are tuning into this broadcast from. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So tonight, Evelyn will be talking to us about why it's so important to create space for Aboriginal voices in our literary institutions. We'll be exploring the history of Aboriginal writers in Australian literature, from ancestral songs and stories to contemporary poetics, and learning why everyone benefits from the ethical representation and reception of Aboriginal writing. Evelyn Araluen is a PhD candidate and teacher at the University of Sydney, working with Indigenous literatures. She is founding member of Students Support Aboriginal Communities, a grassroots activist network in New South Wales. She was born and raised on Darug country with ancestral and language connections to the Bundjalung Nation. Her work has been published in Overland, Southerly and the Best Australian Poems 2016. So we'll have some time at the end for questions. So post your questions in the Facebook event or tweet them at Express Media using the hashtag EMToolkits. So that's capital EMT Toolkits. So thanks so much for joining us for Toolkits Live. I'm going to pass over to Evelyn now, and I'll come back at the end with some questions. Okay, thanks very much, Evelyn.
All right, hello, Jingiwala. So, I mean, I've had an introduction, so I don't know if there's anything else that I really need to say. You've just got me here now. So yeah, today I guess we're going to be having a bit of a yarn about Australian literature, Aboriginal literature, why I don't necessarily think that we can align those two very neatly. We're going to be talking a little bit about the history of Aboriginal literature and writing. We're going to be talking about some of the classifications. We're going to be talking about some of the issues and also how we can move towards a more ethical understanding of Aboriginal literature in relation to the institutions of education that many of us are working within, attending, or will have some sort of proximity towards in our lives. So basically this is going to be a really weird tension between my very prepared and precise transcript that I have here and my more conversational nature. So we're just going to be a little bit fluid. There's a couple of things that I'm going to attempt to make very accessible that are deliberately not accessible because they were not designed to be accessible for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or really anybody that the institution didn't think was particularly appropriate to be in their space. But if you have any questions, please feel free to just send them into a group chat or onto Twitter or Facebook or whatever form of connection, you know, homing pigeon, I don't even care, just shout it out and I can answer all of those at the end, or I can incorporate that into my process of talking with you today. So, and big thanks to Express Media, big thanks to Melody and everybody who's been, Fiona and everybody who's been involved in bringing this together. And I'm hoping we're all gonna have a real good time tonight. So I just thought to begin, what I might do is explain the reason why basically I'm here, and not in a grand cosmic sense, but also not in the sense of why I am in someone's office at the University of Sydney today talking to you about this, but really why I have ended up looking at literature, looking at representation, looking at the nature of Aboriginal people within those particular dynamics. So basically I grew up in a pretty average Aboriginal family out in Western Sydney. I'm one of 6 kids. We ancestrally come from the Bundjalung Nation, but really we've got connections all across New South Wales. So I grew up on Darug country, and my great-grandfathers had connections there, and that's where my family have been born for 4 generations now. But I've also grown up with a lot of cultural influences from Yorta Yorta, because my auntie lives just in the other town over in Mount Druitt. So like many young Aboriginal people today, I've had a fairly fluid exposure to a lot of different ways of being Aboriginal and a lot of different representations of Aboriginality. I didn't have a great time at school. I was kicked out, but then I was, you know, lucky enough that I found somewhere that worked really well for me. And I was able to follow my main passion, which was English. I also had a lot of other things that I liked, like music and art, but it turns out I can't sing despite what I keep telling myself. And so I ended up going into the University of Sydney because I thought, yep, big flash uni. My dad went here in the 60s, you know, big important narrative for my family. I should be really keen to be in this space. And I started studying literature, I started studying English, and I was really struck by the emotional exhaustion that it took to constantly be in these spaces and just wait for somebody to say something really insensitive about Aboriginal people, Aboriginal literature, Aboriginal representation, because I knew it was coming. And worse, sometimes it didn't come, and sometimes we were just never brought up. And nobody wanted to acknowledge our literature, our representation, our place within the institution, really. So that was a challenging thing for several years, and I had to listen to a lot more about Chaucer than I would have liked to have. You know, no hate to Chaucer, but like, geez, they do go on. So I found my undergraduate experiences fairly challenging, and then I got to the end of my honours degree, and that was in 2014. And basically, many of you would be aware of what happened at the end of 2014 related to the University of Sydney, and a particular scandal with our current, at the time, head of poetry, Barry Spur. So basically, on the same night that I was at the University of Sydney for the Charlie Perkins Memorial Oration, and I was like getting an award for my studies and my research and for doing well at school like you're supposed to, that was the same day when everybody discovered, hey, this man is an incredible racist who has been saying horrendous things about Aboriginal people on the university's emailing system. He said that we were a waste of space, in words that I won't repeat here, and everybody was really offended. Everybody was very horrified that he was, at the time, on the national curriculum review under the then Education Minister, Christopher Pyne, and that he was making these recommendations to basically strike Aboriginal representation off of the curriculum. People seem to forget all of that when a year later those recommendations were put through and approved, and basically everything that he said about Aboriginal people being a waste of space, taking up too much space, and space is a really key thing here, it all essentially was put into legislation. There was no real difference between the language and the vitriol that he expressed in his emails and the realities that he put in place with his position of power. So that was not a great thing for me to be feeling when I'm at this very delicate stage of my work, where I've realised that I don't really have a whole lot of life skills and I can't really leave university because who knows what I'd do next. And I had made a decision to continue doing some research, and then suddenly I just didn't really have the option to switch off from all of these anxieties I'd had for years about the way in which my people, my histories, my stories are represented or not represented in the university, in the classroom, in everyday spaces. So that was the state of mind that I entered my postgraduate research in. I felt that the whole world was against me and that nobody was here to help me. Nobody really wanted me to be successful in whatever vague pursuit I was making regarding the representation of Aboriginal literatures. And I was wrong. There were plenty of people who were interested in helping me. But unfortunately, I also discovered the other end of the spectrum that begins with people like Barry Spur, who just simply do not want to engage with Aboriginal representation. You have people out there who not only engage with Aboriginal representation, but they seek to exploit it, they seek to contain it, they seek to use it to adorn their own works, to make their own lives seem interesting. They abuse whatever knowledge and proximity they may have to us and to our culture, And essentially this tradition of misuse and erasure has just come to qualify the ways in which Aboriginal literatures are seen within the nation state that is invading this country now. So it's not an easy position to find yourself in when this is something that you're incredibly passionate about, and you just know that at either end of the spectrum, you are going to be met with very unproductive attitudes. So that was where I was at in 2015 when I began my research. And I was right in thinking that the system was not really prepared to help me, or that the system was not structured in a way that was going to be able to assist me in engaging with the literatures of my people, not just within this sort of loose idea of visibility or exposure, like, aren't I so great because I'm reading Black literature and I can add that to my Goodreads list and connect it to my Facebook so everybody sees, but in an actual generative sense in which you are saying it is not enough that this exists because people aren't reading it, or if they're reading it, they don't know what to say about it, or they're saying horrendously offensive things, or they're just putting it on the curriculum at the very end in the last week because they don't want to have to think about it, but they know they have an obligation to have some sort of engagement with it. So it's fraught territory. It was always going to be fraught territory. Penny Van Toorn, who's an academic whose work I admire very much and would really recommend her book, Writing Never Arrives Naked, which gives a history of Aboriginal encounters with writing cultures from first European contact, but also really usefully challenges the parameters that we have, that we've been using to constitute writing and literature for Aboriginal people. She makes the point that since the very first moment that writing entered our worlds, our engagement with it has always been political. If you look at the earliest histories of Aboriginal people engaging with different forms of literacy, so Bennelong's letter to Lord Sydney in 1796, which is actually the first moment in which we really classify an Aboriginal person having some sort of authorship, and I have an issue with the fact that that's supposedly the first moment of authorship, but I'll get to that a little bit later. But that was 1796. Now, the story goes that it was Cath Walker who drew New Knuckle, and she was the one that began Indigenous writing or Aboriginal writing or Black writing, or however you want to constitute it. And sometimes they get a little bit more flexible, and it's, David Unayapun in 1929, even though his manuscript of Native Legends was essentially stolen. There is contention over when that history begins, but regardless, it's a much older history than many people are willing to concede. So that's kind of the starting point for the discussion that I want to be having today. It's our literary production has always been situated in this incredibly politicized space, this incredibly volatile space. It's not safe for us. It hasn't historically been safe for us, but I'm very proud to say that there are so many Aboriginal people out there today who are creating new spaces, who are challenging the ones that we are currently situated within, but who are demanding better for those who are yet to come. And so that is a really promising time in which we are in right now, and I'll be talking about some of the incredible authors which have been contributing to that a little bit later. But what I just want to do now is just kind of start going on my script, and that's when things get a little bit weird. But just to begin, I'd like to read you this quote, which I really love. I've always really loved this quote. It's from an essay by Jennifer A. Martinello, and it was in Southerly a couple of years ago. It's a Voids, Voices and Story Without End special edition in 2002. She writes, "I am bark, engraved by the continuous cartography of my peoples, their histories. I am dream, the unsilenced, the ink that runs from the tongues of languages to their inscriptions in print, paper, minds." These words, that I am bark, I am engraved, are a critical and poetic demonstration of the central role that inscription plays in our ontologies, a role that defies the Cartesian separation of our bodies, our spirits, our countries, waters and ancestors. Martinello, when she's in dialogue with her own family and community narratives and teachings, is placing story at the centre of Tukurpa and the earth, both creation and continuum. She quotes from one of her elders, "Them white fella pages Tukurpa now too, because it's us mob that's making the marks on them. marking ourselves like we've always been, like we'll go on being, tracing our tracks on the paper. So unlike some other really dodgy theoretical applications that have just been slapped onto Aboriginal literatures lately, and again, we're talking about the more careerist end of the spectrum here, the transformative notion that writing can and must be desecularized offers us a way of understanding the very extensive history of Aboriginal agency in literature. Desecularization, and I haven't really quite clarified the appropriate term for that because I just don't really think that it's a term that I can find an English equivalent for, but let's just use the spiritual here in the sense in which it embodies the ways in which our spirit is land, our spirit is ancestor, our spirit is placed. It's not a concept unfamiliar to literary theory and culture, and in fact hermeneutics and poetics are very much rooted in the ideas of theology and ceremony, but like all points of contact between Indigenous and settler epistemologies, it's a site of complete dissonance when it comes to the reception and reading of Aboriginal expression. People don't know what to do with dreaming, with Jakurpa, so they seek to contain it under structures of mythos or to appropriate it with their own settler forms of expression. So the best example that I can kind of think of that is the Baz Luhrmann ad that came around when Australia, his terrible epic movie, Australia came out. So we are that magical kid that just breaks into your house and spreads magical dirt around, except the magical dirt is our culture or something like that. You don't know why we're doing it, but you don't need to know because some white dude's making money off of American tourists at the end of the day, and that's what we're all here for. So that's a really important side of dissonance, that complete misunderstanding about the value of spirit and the ongoing significance of spirit and spirituality. Another really central side of dissonance that I need to clarify even early on in this discussion across settler and Indigenous epistemologies is the ideological predication of that Cartesian separation between ourselves as Indigenous people and our countries, our lands and waters, our families, our human and creation ancestors, and all living things. Like I'm talking quite an embodied way here, not just the spiritual. Eileen Morton Robinson, who is an amazing quantum feminist, argues against the notion that there is something essentialist about Indigenous identity and Indigenous standpoints in a manner that's really, really relevant here. She writes that from an Indigenous epistemology, what is essentialist is the premise upon which such criticism is situated. The Western definition of the self as multiple, becoming and unfixed. This conception of self, whose humanness is disconnected from the earth, values itself above every other living thing. Whose humanness is disconnected from the earth, repetition there. Doesn't matter if I say it in the right tone. It's the form of strategic essentialism, basically, that can silence and dismiss non-Western constructions that don't define themselves in quite the same way. And that silencing is enabled by various other systems like patriarchal knowledge. Western epistemologies are very much embedded within that, and the ability to see the ability to kind of like contain what it means to be human, to state the terms of that and to complete the terms of that, and to also state what does and does not constitute knowledge. That's not really a human power from our perspective. So there's an issue with this sort of secular approach to literature when it comes to Aboriginal people, and there's an issue with that Descartes kind of Cartesian separation. These are two very, very central concepts in literary theory, and the reason why I critique them is because a lot of literary theory that comes from these perspectives has not really got very much to say about Aboriginal literature. So what we do need to do is we need to proceed into a theoretical space that is capable of meeting Indigenous literatures with the respect that they deserve, and is capable of acknowledging the fluidity and the trauma that is embedded within those structures. One particular example of this is what Jonathan Dunk calls the negative lyric, like negative theology, in which language must unlanguage itself, deconstruct and distance the form that has been shaped by God to arrive at a place beyond the authority and positivism of God, except here replace God with lyricism, which is really what the lyric poem actually sought to do in the first place, and search for a mode of speaking for the self and of subjectivity without reinscribing the Cartesian self, the undreamed, unlanded, unancestored other. The key is to make this very political. A knitting pattern poem is incredibly interesting and maybe it escapes some of the problems that we have here, but it doesn't do much beyond that at a time when undreaming, unlanding, unancestoring, uncustodian, dispossessing, displacing, post-colonising, decolonising of Indigenous peoples by the settler colonial industrial complex maintains the world in which we are allowed to do that. Maintains the university, maintains the book club, maintains the poetry reading. There are not really a lot of spaces in which we can actually evade that. So straight off the bat, the terms in which we can actually create and generate literary production these days and at this particular point in time, and indeed historically up until this point, have always been incredibly fraught. These are houses that are not built to contain us. When I talk about what I feel is coming and what I feel is breaking down some of those structures and challenging those structures, I like to talk about young female poets because these are the spaces that I move within. These are the women who inspire me. These are the communities that I'm within. So Ellen Van Nieven, Allison Whittaker and Lorna Monroe are really important expressions of agency and disobedience at this particular time. They are searching for languages of self and culture past the forefront of these particular splits that I've just talked about. So to just like run through a few examples of that very briefly, one poem that I really love by Ellen Van Nieven, and I have her collection here actually, Comfort Food, which is all dodgy and soiled from my dirty hands pouring through it a million times, but get this if you don't already have this. She's got this poem called Dalga Yugamba Death Poem, which positions a move towards power within temporalities of both loss and perpetuity. She writes, "I don't speak my language, but I speak yours and I write it well." In Cousins, another poem in the collection, she looks at anxieties of dislocation in which language is both cultural integrity and negative capability. And negative capability here, I'm linking that back to the idea of the negative lyric here, the searching for a language to contain that which we've really only ever coded in language. She writes, "This land heals all my city blues. I haven't the language for that. You read me after all this time. I haven't the language for that." So it's worth saying that Ellen doesn't really throw around Yugamba. She doesn't throw around language willy-nilly. Like, she thinks very, very carefully about it. And when I recognize certain words, it's an incredibly powerful thing for me. We actually share a language group. Bunjalung sits just under Yugamba. And so when I see that, what it signifies to me is this process of reclaiming and resurgence. She's not just using this to adorn her writing. She is using this in the sense of evocation, like this is powerful, this is ceremony, right? She's using it to root her to moiety. She's using it to root herself to her ancestral and creation skins. She moves through personal and communal signifiers. She uses them to identify herself in age and in gender. She writes, "Freshwater woman, I am Talgan. Hairy woman, European, I am naked like Muni." In the way that she writes, language is really like it's the agency of self-representation. It's not just the act of self-representation. It's not the presentation of the self. It's like the agency, the power that she has to be able to use that vocabulary, to be able to recode herself. And remember, this is really important given the extensive history we have of Indigenous women being written by settlers in incredibly touchy ways. Like, Janine Lane wrote an incredible essay a couple of months ago for Overland, which she talks about the experience of being a young Aboriginal woman being forced to read representations, supposedly representations of her from, you know, Catherine Susanna Pritchard and Kate Grenville. And she talks about the experience of that and the trauma of that, the trauma of somebody who probably would never actually speak to you on the street, who would never actually acknowledge you, would leave the room when you walk in there, claiming that they have the right to represent you in their literatures. You know, it's not a fun experience. And I really recommend that you read Janine Lane's essay on that because she says it better than I can, but it's a very political thing. She's not just talking about this as a personal trauma. It is a structuring of the world in which Indigenous peoples don't have the agency to represent themselves. It's not just us. It's not just here. That is a global phenomenon. There's a poem that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on this evening from Allison Whittaker, which is called Sharp Tongue, which I think really amazingly engages, like brutally engages with the trauma of things like returning to language. It's actually not something that is represented easily, without pain, without difficulty. This is our journey back. And I've written a little bit about it in my poem Learning Bundjalung on Tharawal, which I think has had some interesting interpretations. Some people see it as a very affirming poem. Some people have seen it as a very melancholy poem. I wrote it as a dark poem. It's a dark poem which acknowledges that, like, hey, this is not easy. This is painful. This is difficult. We do not know how to walk back into our languages. And I love her poem, Sharp Tongue, from Lemons and the Chicken Wire, where she talks about language as an economy. So she's got these lines like, my tongue will catch on this page and drag slow and I will make a seam of myself. But those are printed alongside a receipt for a Gamilarate to English dictionary and a learning guide. The total comes to $104, including GST. While speaking, the noisy wound will burst. It's really important to point out that she's writing like really experimentally here. And I think another one of the issues that we have when we talk about Aboriginal literature is that we just have these perceptions of really fixed, really limited, almost childlike. If you look at the earliest reviews of Udru Knuckles' first collections in the 60s, they basically refer to her as a child. Like, they're talking about how she is writing these really immature verses, and it's as if somebody's only just been introduced to English literature and they've attempted to write a homework assignment. That's what people thought about her incredibly volatile literature at the time. So experimental and conceptual is just not something that people are really interested in acknowledging Aboriginal people as having the capacity to be. Like, that's apparently a thing that we just haven't got the history to work into yet. I think that's absolutely ridiculous, and I think Allison Whittaker does that experimental work better than most Australian poets at the moment. Her images in that poem are violent, they are embodied. She says either that or bloody and salty and a monument to the last. Earlier in the collection, she's using Gamilarate, but she's using specific Gamilarate words that are actually located in stories of, like, the story of Dinawan Nai, which is about an emu that is tricked and killed by a gluttonous stranger. She uses the language that positions herself as this figure of intrusion and greed, and it's like an incredibly painful confrontation to see her placing that language within her story of returning to language through commodified means. When you look at those poems, you realize that she is, like, very viscerally resisting possibilities of affirming relationships between Gamilarate and English, and she is threatening rupture. We are not writing easily at the moment. We are not writing nicely at the moment. This is threatening. This is violent. This is traumatized. This literature bears trauma, and it speaks back to that. Another poet that I just want to briefly talk about as well is the incredible Gamilarate Wiradjuri poet Lorna Monroe and her writing. She has done a lot of work in this community, and I have immense respect for everything that she's done. Her work is really about entanglement over basic comprehension, and I see a lot of that in Lionel Fogarty and his writing as well. So she writes, eat this country, immerse yourself in our knowing, consume our hindered growing, and maybe we can conversate. Her verbs are immersive. They move towards equal exchanges without a need for transformation. She writes no signs in contested spaces to be eclipsed, no translations. So she's writing in a way which is just as volatile as Allison Whittaker. And she's writing in a way which very knowingly is resisting things like that assumption of the Cartesian separation. So another quote, I'm going to scream the next time I see a road sign that defines the first language and bloodline of a space now occupied by ignorance. Sometimes be deliberate. With those statements that you make, you can't get rid of it. Once your mouth has made the mistake, get over it. Once your soul has been misplaced, honour it. Can't go back for the hell of it. The poem is exploring a drive through but not away from uncertainty, and she is very didactic in calling out colonial inscriptions embedded in genre features of journey and self-development. But she's also attaching ignorance to this you object. She's speaking back to the colonizer, and she's undermining the notion of a place as a passive surface of settler re-inscription. And again, inscription is just this very, very important thing that I will come back to quite a lot. The reason why I like the idea of inscription and emphasizing inscription over just very broad terms like writing or literatures or the text is because inscription is actually something, I feel, a word which contains an embodied process and a word which actually has some kind of sense of impact. An inscription is something like, that's a textual object, yes, but it is embedded on the page, it's embedded on the tree, it is inscribed, it is it just, to me, contains more impact. So I haven't really quite felt through whether or not that is a word that I think can contain all of the possibilities, because like I said, I don't really think there are words in English that can contain all of the possibilities for how we should be understanding our cultural, textual, literary productions. But I think inscription is something that talks about how we would mark trees, it talks about how we mark stone, it talks about what we have left for ancestors to come. So I think the reason why I like to talk about these couple of poems and these writers is actually because of this word shame and this idea of shame. And I've written about this in an essay where I look at the role of shame in contemporary Australian poetics. And it's a word that doesn't really have quite a clear meaning across different cultural contexts. So when I spoke to Lorna about this, she told me that words like shame and pride are for her colonial intrusions. There is no word for shame in Wiradjuri, and if there is one in Bundjalung or Darug, I don't know it. And yet we say shame and shame job all of the time in Australian Aboriginal English. So there is a distinction between guilt and shame, in which shame is something about the past and the future, and it reflects more on individual and communal collective identities. So white settler descendants can reject the guilt from the theft of Aboriginal land, but it's harder to reject the shame of continuing profit over this dispossession. Shame too can be respect, responsibility and reciprocity, which are the principles that I believe should be embedded into the ways in which we're engaging with Aboriginal literature, Aboriginal knowledges, Aboriginal bodies, Aboriginal people, culture, everything. Respect, responsibility and reciprocity, these are the principles which should govern our existence on this country. So I think shame can be a positive thing because shame calls you into responsibility. So when I wrote that essay talking about shame in contemporary Australian poetics, I was very clearly saying, yes, there are things in Australian literature that we need to be ashamed about. The erasure we need to be ashamed about. The complete denial of that history, or the reluctant admission that, oh, this history has begun when we had contact with your systems of writing. Like that is shameful. That is embarrassing. It's not generative. Imagine these systems being upheld as the only structure in which you can engage with Aboriginal literatures, and it's also a commodified structure. Just, we have to keep that in mind. Publishing is this incredibly generative industry, and there are some incredible Aboriginal people working in that. Sandra Phillips and Anita Heiss, for example, have done amazing things over the years for Aboriginal publishing and Aboriginal representation through that, but it is a commodified form. Imagine that that is like the only structure that you can engage with the stories of your people that are valued by institutions or schools. You know, like you can have these stories when you go home with your community and with your family, but when you go to school, when you go to university, when you want to start producing these stories yourself beyond your living room, those are the ways in which it's perceived. Like it's not a fun thing. And I'm always trying to think of who's coming next. Like, who's coming after me? What is going to happen in 10 years when somebody's sitting in the same seat in the lecture theatre that I was sitting in, having their first introduction to English literature class? Are they going to feel as uncomfortable as I felt? That's, I think, something that we can all try to actually benefit ourselves in the way that we're approaching this literature. So for me, like, I actually started to really question some of my assumptions about theory, about representation, and about the different forms of that representation when I actually started learning language, like learning Bundjalung. That was for me an incredibly transformative thing, because apart from anything else, like, it was an educational space which validated the things that I'd grown up with as being taught as normal. Like, this was my world, you know, respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. We are the land is us. We have been here always, we will always be here. We need to protect the land because the land is us and it will always be here. These logics were actually confirmed in an educational space, and I didn't realise the importance of having that until that very moment. And that was the moment that I started writing poetry. I'd never written a poem before I started learning language, before I started learning Bundjalung. And that's why I wrote that poem, Learning Bundjalung on Tharal, because to me it was about something that I needed to begin, but also I did need to acknowledge the displacement, the dislocation, the dispossession that's gone on there. What was really interesting, though, was that the way that poem was curated, I suppose is a word, in a number of different spaces, and the interpretations that people gave it. As I mentioned before, for some people that is a sad poem, but for the Australians, oh, the poor Aboriginal girl mourning the complete loss of her language. Like, no, that's ridiculous. My language hasn't gone anywhere. It's actually a resurgence poem. But people are looking to reinforce the narratives they already have about Aboriginal literature. So to just go back to like this historical trajectory of how people have engaged with and perceived Aboriginal literature over history, right? So it was initially with a lot of like public resistance and animosity when the publications of Wodjuna Knuckle, Cath Walker started coming out, and Jack Davis and Kevin Gilbert. And it's also important to note that these were written in spite of these state-sanctioned policies which denied the right of a public education to children with even one drop of Aboriginal blood. Like, people want to talk about Wodjuna Knuckle's poetry being primitive, and then they want to say like, oh, she's not good enough at being a poet, she's not good enough at being Aboriginal, where is she, what is she? It's like, contextualize that, man. Actually place that within this history of dispossession and displacement and the mission system and the reserve system. Like, actually talk about that history. So I've got a quote here about Cath Walker. She is not in a position to have a very sensitive appreciation of European verse rhythms, but at the same time, she cannot use the structure and techniques of the poetry of her Aboriginal ancestors. It was 1973. Academics who were writing in 1973 could still be around. Many of them still are, worth thinking about. But again, like I'm talking about with Barry Spur, the critical engagement with Aboriginal writing of this period and the critical writings about Aboriginal writing of this period are like only barely removed from the rhetoric of assimilation and protectionist policies. We always do have to engage with how people are talking within the institution and then how people are talking within the government. We do need to question how those spaces overlap when we're looking at these representations. It's very, very important. The study of Aboriginal literatures and the historical study of Aboriginal literatures is something which actually, like, it is, as you can probably guess, it's a much more political thing than you would see in other areas, but we are forced to look at a number of different things that people researching Chaucer don't necessarily have to do, you know. Those literatures are treated as neutral, and we never get that option. We also never get the option of anonymity. We have to be very present. We have to be performative. We have to be the Aboriginal subject who has produced the Aboriginal writing, and you need to be able to write, you know, personal bios of us in the Australian and all sorts of stuff. We were only ever gradually admitted into the literary conversation as long as the terms and the structures of that conversation continued to support the program of cultural imperialism. So, as I said, we've had this move away from the outright racism, but that did not come easily, and many Aboriginal people fought for that. Marcia Langton, Anissa High, Sandra Phillips, Alison Ravenscroft, Jackie Huggins, Rosemary Vandenberg, Peter Minter, they all fought for that history. It was an embodied process. Uncle Ken Canning has spoken to me about leaping onto the stage in Redfern so he could speak at an open mic, and he was never really allowed beyond the open mic. Lorna Monroe can talk about her family and that history of Redfern, of performance, and the relationship between performance and protest. And while these stories are not very well circulated about how Aboriginal people have had to fight just to have our literature is acknowledged as literature, these are very, very present histories that can be accessed by people who actually want to take the time and are willing to restructure how they perceive the authoritative narrative of that. You know, it doesn't have to be the subjective narrative of the development of our literature or the circulation of our literature. No, this is complicated, this is complex, this is entangled, and that's what I love about Lorna's poetry. She is emphasizing entanglement. Everything is entangled. There is nuance for all of these stories. There is no singular fixed Indigenous identity, so therefore there cannot be the fixed Indigenous story. So that comes into this really important thing which I like to emphasize, which is that in order for us to actually talk ethically about Aboriginal literatures, we need to have context. We do need to have a very clear historical understanding of what we're dealing with. We need to recenter our expectation of authorship, our expectation of literature, our expectation of consumption, because it's all problematic. Everything's problematic. But we also need to be very critical with the ways in which we have perceived connections and communities. So I think that we actually have this really incredible time right now with young Aboriginal authors who are working together, who are taking advantage of all kinds of social media communities, all kinds of literary communities to foster mentorship relationships between all of us. And that's like a really, really incredible thing. But we're doing that like by manipulating the system that is supposed to keep us there all competitive with each other, arguing with each other or something like that. And then they'll wheel one of us out in rotation at a literary festival or something like that. You know, it is very important for us that we are having these communities, that we are actively making these connections. That's very, very important. But we should not allow those connections to exist simply because we are the Aboriginal poets. We are the Aboriginal people in the room. Because those are the kinds of problems that lead to this collective dismissal from people like Spur of our literatures. Like, how could anyone say that Aboriginal people have not contributed to Australian literature? Have you read Alexis Wright? Like, nobody knows what to do with Alexis Wright. She is so challenging. She is so volatile, like somebody who writes in a way which speaks to so many traditions so well and challenges and experiments with the very language of subjectivity and the very idea of subjectivity. Like, nah, she's influenced everyone. She's shaken everybody to the core. So what we need to do, instead of just essentializing everything down to Aboriginal literature, and this is me coming back to my reasons why I think Aboriginal literature is a bit fraught, is we need to be both localized but also globalized, if that makes sense. So we need to talk about nations, we need to talk about language groups, we need to talk about specific experiences, because there is no one experience of being Aboriginal. But what we can also do in a way to circumvent the expectation that our identity should exist in proximation to the nation state that we were colonised by, we should actually be searching for how we connect with other Indigenous people all over the world through things like our experiences of climate change, our use of social media as writing ourselves and creating our own textual identities, our use of poetry and protest. We can be looking for those kinds of connections and focusing on those kinds of connections to create a more comprehensive, a more nuanced, and essentially a more ethical understanding of who we are as Indigenous peoples all over the world. This is a kind of globalism, and this is a kind of transnational connection that actually can achieve something, because we are then able to, as minorities, we are able to form communities with other minorities. It's a very important principle that we should be keeping in mind about the ways in which we are trying to have conversations between Indigenous peoples. from an outsider's perspective, that doesn't mean that you just read 2 black books from different countries and you go, oh, I'm going to squish them together. Like, no, that's not going to achieve anything. What it does mean is that we do need to be critical of the nation state, the settler colonial nation state. We need to throw out labels like post-colonialism because they don't actually correspond to any kind of material reality. We need to listen to Indigenous people and let them define and identify themselves and let them be in charge of how they are presented. And then we need to read their books. We need to watch their movies. We need to listen to their radio shows. We need to view their art. We need to be engaging more with various forms of Indigenous production, and we don't need to stand there and go, well, if you are not improving upon and competent within Western literary traditions, you're not good enough. Who does that benefit? Honestly, who does that benefit? Because that's just attempting to create a standard in which Indigenous people perform non-indigeneity. Well, sorry, but that's not really for me. And that's not really for very many Indigenous people today. So I guess I'm circling round to this position in which I feel that it's messy, I feel that it's entangled, I feel that it's complicated, and I feel that there's a lot of work that Indigenous peoples all over the world need to be allowed to do before non-Indigenous people come into our space and start taking over. But I think that where we can start right now and where we can all start together is by looking at things like the Macquarie Pen Anthology of Aboriginal Literature project. Have a look at just what is in that timeline. Have a look at how political it is. Have a look at how challenging it is. Have a look at where our authorship actually started. Engage with various forms. Engage with various acts of performance, of inscription, of identity. Just absorb it. Allow yourself to be witness to that. It's not about how you want to use it. It doesn't have to be about how you want to use it. It's not about how you want to write about it. It's not about how you want to use it to adorn your CV. We've had a very long experience of that, and it's not really getting us anywhere. Somebody who doesn't know anything about Aboriginal culture shouldn't be standing there making money and producing knowledge about that, because that's unethical. Like, that is profoundly unethical. What we should be doing is we should be creating space, creating dialogues, listening, acknowledging our own ignorance and refusing to allow that to become the emotional labour of Indigenous people, while creating environments in which Indigenous people feel okay about entering the room. I was okay to enter the room even after the Barry Spur incident, but that was because of the particular circumstances in which I was raised and the particular experiences that I had throughout my life. But I wonder about how many people left then. Like, I wonder about how many people were stopped from proceeding any further with that. So I have ranted for long enough. I guess I just want to say thank you for listening, and I hope that you will continue this messy, entangled conversation with me, not just tonight, but also, you know, we are in this, whatever collective it is in, we are in it together. So I would like to think that you want to listen to me just as much as I want to listen to you. So thank you.
Thanks, Evelyn. That was fantastic, and you're fantastic. Thanks so much for being here. So we haven't received any questions through Twitter yet. I'd really encourage you all to jump on there and tweet at us, or on the Facebook event. But I just thought maybe I'd use this as an opportunity to ask you about your own poetic practice.
Yeah, I was actually just going through Twitter then. I was like, oh, nobody likes this.
No, it's true.
Yeah, my own poetic practice. So I'm still very new at my poetic practice, because I started writing poetry in, I think it was 2015. And like I said, that really did come 100% out of my experiences of learning Bundjalung. I felt that I just didn't have poetry. I didn't have anything to say, and I didn't have a language to begin saying anything before that moment in time. So over the last year and a half, 2 years or something like that, I've actually been trying to think very critically about what I do feel poetics are. So I didn't really get the opportunity to read much Aboriginal poetry when I was younger because, surprise, surprise, schools are not really structured in ways in which they're throwing that at you. But what I found was that when it discovered me, or I discovered it, there was this whole language there and this whole structure of aesthetics. Marsha Langton, actually, in the 90s, she wrote about the idea of, like, is there an Aboriginal aesthetic? And maybe there isn't, but I certainly know that there was this dialogue about what it means to be an Indigenous woman from the southeastern coast of Australia that I was seeing in the work of Lorna Monroe and Allison Whittaker. And I was like, oh, hang on. This is something I recognize. This is a presence I recognize. And I very actively worked to make sure that I read more Aboriginal poetry than I've read any other kind of poetry. So I am very proud that I am now embedded within those forms of readership. It's a tiny way to decolonize oneself, like a very minute way to do that. But I've also had a really great opportunity to learn from other people of colour from other cultures and other countries. And the two biggest things that I have learnt in terms of how to force yourself to write poems when you don't really know how to write poems very well because you only started writing them a year and a half ago, is to rewrite and to try to rewrite whatever you're writing very differently and very experimentally until you get to a point where you don't recognize it. And to edit by basically every time you write a poem, you write it and you let it sit and then you come back with a red pen and you cross out everything you think you've written before. And you do not allow yourself that kind of repetition. So those were the two things that for me were kind of like, okay, I don't really know what I'm doing yet, but I do know how to stop myself from doing the same old I don't know what I'm doing yet thing.
Yeah, it's very important, I think, to recognise those patterns in yourself. I did see a little question, I think, flash up in your phone from the lovely Amelia Dale, maybe?
Amelia Dale is...
Oh, no, she's just...
It's a statement.
Okay.
It's a statement on messy, entangled, embodied Aboriginal literary histories.
Maybe I was going to ask you another question. Yeah. About the problem with landscape poetry in Australia. But then I thought you read a really brilliant poem on Sunday called Drop Bear Poetics, and I might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but I feel like that's a really great answer to that question in a lot of ways. And if maybe you felt like reading it?
Oh, I can read it. I thought you wouldn't talk about it.
You can talk about it.
Or no, I can totally read it because I love reading that poem. So I'm actually basically trying to sell this poem to Amelia Dale and to SOD Press so that they put up with my crazy attack on Australian contemporary poetics.
Great. So we'll get you to read this and then I think we might wrap up.
Yep.
That's a great way to end, I think.
All right.
Go for it.
All right. Drop Bear Poetics. Tiddlicks say, I am such great thirst, I will drain the land and drag my big fat belly across the empty sea. Bunyips say, I'm going to gobble you up if you step by waters where I sleep, and with wet claws I will snatch your spine and ankles to fill them with stain and stench. What the mopokes say don't need saying if you were grown up under his eyes. Now here's the part you write Black Snake down for that dilly of national flair. True God, you don't know how wild I'm going to be to every fucking post-mob Blinky Bill trying to crack open my country. Mining in metaphors that place you felt you. Somewhere in the Royal National. Wagon says use heart, but I say rage and dreaming at the gloss green palm fronds of this gentry aesthete antique. Pot plant sovereignty sharing rights with the not so old ones. If you're talking that talk, you got to scrape it from my schoolhouse walls. Filter gollywog ashtray, snuggle pot kitchen to your pastoral deconstruct. Fill 4 and 20 pies with artisan magpies. If you sever their heads, you can wear them to the doof. I say rage and dreaming for this. For making lyre the lyre bird, for making my medic the power Byami gave when ribbons mischief swallowed first life. Ochre dust, creation breath, ancestor song. We aren't here to hear you poem. If you do wrong, you get wrong. You get gobbled up.
Thank you. I love that poem so much. So great.
Good. It's hopefully going to be out there in the near future.
Keep an eye out, everybody. Okay, thanks everybody so much for joining us. Thank you, Evelyn, so much.
Thank you for having me.
And everybody, you can tune in next week with Jennifer Down talking to Tony Birch, all things place and setting. And also stay tuned at the Express Media website to hear about future Express Media Toolkits live sessions with Bella Lee and Eleanor Gomez. Okay, great. Thanks everyone. See you. Bye.